1853, Japan finally emerged from its 220-year isolation thanks to Commodore Matthew Perry, the initiator and the builder of this endeavor. He set foot on Japanese shores in July of that year with 4 armed ships. Prior to that, the shogunate government had closed the country's doors to the world, not allowing anyone to enter or exit. The only means of communication with the outside world for decades was solely through Dutch and Chinese traders who were permitted to come and go at specific times of the year in the port of Nagasaki. After Japan opened its closed doors to the outside world, the world superpowers, which had long awaited such a day, began their usual practice of exploiting a technologically and industrially backward country as a prelude to colonization. The shogunate, faced with difficulties, began signing treaties and granting privileges to the superpowers, but the Japanese people viewed these actions by the shogunate as a national betrayal. Coincidentally, these events occurred during the Opium Wars in China and its colonization by Britain, people also fearing ending up in a similar unfavorable fate as China. These events intertwined and eventually led to a significant event in Japanese history: the restoration of imperial power. If you want to see how Japan progressed from a period of backwardness to a point where it could play a role in the world wars, stay with us as we explain this evolutionary process to you in a completely simple and concise manner. Just before we continue, let me say that making each of these videos takes dozens of hours. So please give us energy with your likes and stay with us until the end of the video. In 1860, a series of political assassinations planted the seeds of civil war in Japan. The shogunate, seeking to eliminate its opponents, allowed foreign powers to intervene militarily to quell the cities that were the strongholds of the rebels. The samurais, unable to tolerate the actions of the shogunate, sided with the restoration of power to the former imperial regime. For this purpose, in 1862, Emperor Mutsuhito convened to plan to overthrow the shogunate and the Civil War of 1868. Many Western historians believe that it was the Western superpowers that motivated Japan for the significant changes and developments of the following decades, and the civilization we see in Japan today is the result of efforts of the Western advisors and teachers of that era. While it cannot be refuted, one should not underestimate the understanding and readiness of the Japanese people for comprehending and learning sciences, arts, and the sacrifices of distinguished individuals of the nation. There were also other countries that established commercial and cultural treaties with the superpowers of the time, but it is less seen than in Japan that their country's situation improved from what it was. In 1867, the reformists forced the shogunate to resign from governance, and from then on all authority returned to the imperial court. In 1868, Emperor Mutsuhito formally ascended to the throne, and his reign was named the Meiji era, which lasted until 1912. It was during this time that Japan gradually moved towards becoming a superpower. A new army inspired by the Prussian military was established, and the samurai class was deprived of the right to carry 2 swords and enlisted in the army. Shortly after, the Japanese Navy was strengthened and modeled after the British Navy. Control was imposed on the monetary system, the postal service began operating, and most importantly, national education principles quickly made the Japanese people literate. In 1889, a new constitution was drafted, which made Japan the owner of a parliamentary system, effectively reducing the emperor's involvement in government affairs. On the other hand, industrial reforms and financial matters were contemporary with the political revolution. Japan began borrowing from foreign countries, and in 1869, the first telegraph line between Tokyo and Yokohama was established. A year later, spinning machines were imported into Japan, and all of these factors contributed to the rapid growth of Japan's economy and population during the Meiji era. In 1871, a group of Japanese fishermen mistakenly entered an island called Ryukyu, whose inhabitants were Chinese. and the locals there massacred all the fishermen. The Japanese government was infuriated by these incidents and sent a protest letter to China, demanding that the culprits be punished. China responded by stating that the residents of that part of the island had been abandoned for some time and the events that occurred there had no connection to the Chinese government. Japan then said that if it sent a military force to the Ryukyu Islands and conquered them, China would recognize its sovereignty over them. In 1874, Japan brought Ryukyu under its control. The Chinese government immediately dispatched a military force there, and it was only a matter of time before China and Japan became embroiled in conflict. However, with British mediation in Beijing, a treaty was signed between China and Japan. China paid compensation to the families of the Japanese fishermen, and in return, Japan evacuated the islands. But after a few years, relations between the two countries soured again, and Japan annexed Ryukyu as part of its own territory. China protested again, leading to the incident between Korea, Japan, and China. In 1894, rebellions broke out in Korea. The Korean king requested assistance from China, and China immediately dispatched its forces there and brutally suppressed the rebellions. Japan seized the opportunity to claim that China's intervention was contrary to an agreement that Japan and China had discussed some time earlier. For this reason, approximately 3,500 Japanese soldiers landed near Seoul, the capital of Korea. They took advantage of the rebellions and seized the Korean royal palace. China, unwilling to lose Korea completely, was forced to take action. Several other wars occurred in the Korean region and surrounding waters, and Japan achieved remarkable victories. Japan was not satisfied only with Korea and immediately began military campaigns into the Manchuria region of China in northern Korea. Eventually, the path to capturing Beijing was opened for the samurais. China had no choice but to surrender in this situation. In 1895, a peace treaty was signed. China recognized Korea's independence. Additionally, Taiwan and the Liaodong Peninsula were ceded to Japan. This victory proved to the world that Japan was more powerful than anyone had expected. A week after the treaty, the three powers, Germany, France, and Russia, proposed to Japan that it overlook its claim over Liaodong. Japan, seeing itself isolated in the region and knowing it couldn't defend all its colonies, was forced to accept the proposal. To save face, it added an extra sum to the indemnity, and the people of Japan saw this imposition as a great defeat, leading to a wave of dissatisfaction. As a result, Japan began to develop its own ground and naval forces. By the time the war between Japan and Russia began in 1904, Japan had sufficiently strengthened its ground and naval forces to not only face Russia head-on, but also inflict humiliating defeats upon it. The reason for the war between Russia and Japan lay primarily in an alliance formed 2 years earlier between Britain and Japan. Britain was concerned that Russia would continue its occupation of Manchuria in northeastern China and threatens its influence in China. Japan also saw Russia as an obstacle to its territorial expansion and a threat to Korea. Britain also thought to strengthen its ties with Japan to neutralize the possibility of conflict in the region and recognize Japan's claims. However, Britain's prediction turned out to be wrong. One of the clauses of this alliance was the swift evacuation of Russia from Manchuria. However, neither Russia nor China complied with the agreement as they should have, which angered Japan. The dissatisfaction of the two colonial powers eventually led to conflict, and on February 10, 1904, Japan declared war. The battles that ensued over the next year and a half were the largest battles of the era. The Battle of Mukden, in which approximately 630,000 soldiers participated, marked the end of the land warfare between the two states. The Japanese inflicted a major defeat on Russia in this battle. Russia's Baltic fleet even crossed 3 continents to fall into the trap of the newly formed Japanese Navy in the Tsushima Strait and was completely destroyed. After the Battle of Mukden, the Japanese acquired a large amount of ammunition and decided to advance on the island of Sakhalin. However, the equipment for Russia's cold region was insufficient, and Japan also faced financial difficulties. On the other hand, despite the fact that its navy was entirely defeated, Russia still had the capability to continue the war on land. However, this seemed unlikely because at that time, Russia was in a chaotic situation due to internal unrest and was forced to withdraw its troops from the front lines. Following the Treaty of Portsmouth, signed in late summer of 1905, the Russians agreed to recognize Japan's military and economic dominance in Korea. They ceded the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan and also transferred the southern half of Sakhalin Island to Japan for fishing rights. Despite all this, public anger still arose. After 20 months of war, the people expected a more valuable reward. However, Japan's victory and the terms of peace were considered a great success, given that the government knew its financial and manpower resources were almost exhausted. So far, Japan has achieved great successes and was no longer the isolated and unfortunate country of the quarantine era. However, there were still other successes on the horizon to transform Japan into a superpower, which today boasts one of the strongest economies in the world. Okay guys, if you enjoyed it and would like the second part of this video to be made, please support us with likes and subscriptions, and leave your comments in comment section. Until next time, goodbye!